She tore it in half. Right there, in front of everyone. A valid boarding pass, scanned green 30 seconds ago, ripped clean down the middle and dropped onto the tray table like it was trash. The cabin went silent. 87 passengers. Not one of them moved. The man in seat 1A looked at the two pieces of paper. Then he looked up at her. He did not raise his voice. He did not beg. He said quietly, the kind of quiet that fills a room faster than a shout. You just destroyed a valid document. On a plane you don't own. In front of witnesses. She smiled. Economy is that way. 16,000 people would watch what happened next. The flight would leave 2 hours and 17 minutes late. 3 people would lose their jobs before the doors closed. And the woman who tore that boarding pass, she had no idea. No idea who was sitting in that seat. No idea what she had just started. Raymond Holt did not look like a man who owned anything. That was the point. The black polo shirt had no logo. The backpack was worn at the straps, the kind that comes from use rather than neglect. The jeans were clean but unremarkable. He moved through O'Hare International Airport at 4:47 in the afternoon, looking like somebody's neighbor, who had a window seat and a long flight ahead, and nothing to announce about either. Nobody looked twice. Also the point. He moved through the terminal the way water moves through a room, finding the path of least resistance without calling attention to the finding. Gate B9 was 40 yards ahead. Flight Summit 412, Chicago to Los Angeles. Scheduled departure 6:30 p.m. Before leaving his office that morning, Raymond had made one phone call. To Dana Cole, his executive assistant. 12 years. The person who knew every layer of his calendar, his company, and his thinking, usually before he finished thinking it. He had said, I'm on tonight's Summit 4112 out of B9. I need you to keep the seat log for Meridian Group 1A open on your screen from the moment I board. Real time. If anything changes in that log, I need to know the second it changes. Dana had said, define anything. He had said, if my name disappears, that's anything. She had said, dashboard stays open. That was all. No elaboration needed between people who have worked together long enough to know what the spaces mean. He had done this 4 times before. Dallas, Miami, Denver, Seattle. 4 cities where he had dressed down, booked under Meridian Group, and walked onto his own airline as a stranger to watch how people got treated when nobody with authority appeared to be watching. 4 times he had written detailed reports. 4 times those reports had moved up the chain and been absorbed into the institutional mass of a large airline without producing anything that resembled change. This time, the report was going to write itself. He found a seat near the window at gate B9 and set his backpack down, and noticed the old man. He was at last Digley. Seat before the wall. Somewhere past 70, though he carried the years with the ease of someone who had stopped arguing with time and reached a different kind of arrangement with it. Dark Saxons, a face lined deeply in the way of someone who has spent decades paying attention to things that is worth paying attention to. The stillness about him was not emptiness. It was the stillness of someone who had thought about everything already and arrived somewhere on the far side of it. White dress shirt, pressed, not new, but cared for the way things get cared for when they mean something beyond their function. A paperback open on his knee. He was not reading it. He was looking out at the tarmac where the late afternoon light sits, slow exit, planes moving in the distance against sky going gray at the edges. Raymond sat 2 seats away. The old man did not look up. Raymond said nothing. Something passed between them anyway. The acknowledgement that exists between people who have both spent long in the world to know when conversation is required and when it is not. A nod, small. The kind that says I see you without requiring anything further. His name was Walter Gaines. Raymond knew that. Walter did not know Raymond knew. That detail would matter before the night was over. It would matter in ways Raymond could not have put into words, even if someone had asked to try, which nobody did, because nobody in that gate area was paying attention to 2 black men sitting near a window in comfortable silence, waiting for a plane. Nobody ever was. The gate area had the texture of early evening travel. Families with luggage that had expanded mysteriously since they'd packed it. Business travelers staring at laptops with the hollow focus of people who stopped actually working an hour ago, but couldn't stop performing it. A teenager with headphones large enough to qualify as furniture. Two gate agents moving with the economy of people who have answered the SIS 3 questions 10,000 times. Watched all of it, not restlessly, not with impatience. The way you watch something you are trying to understand before you act on it. The boarding announcement came at 6:08 p.m. First class and premium members. Raymond stood, shouldered his backpack, pulls out his boarding pass, it on plain paper with no flourish. The name on the ticket read Meridian Group, not Raymond Holt, not his personal account or his elite status card with its quiet authority. Meridian Group was one of 14 subsidiary companies under Summit Airways' corporate umbrella, a holding entity. The kind of name appeared on leases and contracts and quarterly filings and not on flight manifests. Nobody had connected it to him yet. 4 trips. Nobody ever had. He walked toward the jet bridge, and that was when Carolyn Voss stepped in front of him. She was 35. 12 years with Summit Airways, which she carried like a credential. The kind of flight attendant who had spent so long sorcering in the performance of authority that the performance and the thing itself had become genuinely indistinguishable to her. She looked at Raymond the way people look at something that doesn't quite belong in the frame the frame they're expecting. The assessment lasted a fraction of a second and had already concluded before conscious thought could have caught up to it. Then she raised one hand. "Sir, your ticket needs additional verification." Raymond stopped. The scanner on the podium to her left showed green. He had watched it scan green. He had heard the beep, identical to the beep it made for the 3 passengers who had walked through directly ahead of him without being stopped. He handed her the boarding pass. She took it, looked at it, set it down on the podium without referencing the scanner. "There may be a system issue. We'll need to hold you here a moment." Behind him, the line moved. Gerald Price walked through, 58 years old, silver hair, the relaxed posture of a man who has never stood in the wrong line in his life and has no framework for imagining that such a thing could apply to him. A platinum status tag on his carry-on caught the gate light. His wife Susan was one step behind. Neither was stopped. Neither was asked anything. The scanner beeped for both. Carolyn smiled at both. Gerald Price did not look at Raymond. Susan glanced over, once, then away. Raymond stood where Carolyn had placed him. He did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not do any of the things that would have made the situation easier for everyone present. Easier to dismiss, easier to fold into the category of minor misunderstanding and move on from. He understood that his stillness was doing something that agitation would undo. So he was still. He waited. Carolyn, near the mouth of the jet bridge, a young woman in a Summit Airways uniform was watching. Avery Fields, 22 years old, 4 months of training, 2 rounds of evaluation, 1 very tense phone call with her mother the previous night. This was her first solo flight as a working crew member. She was excited and afraid in the ratio that only exists on the first day of something that actually matters to you. She had watched the scanner. She had seen the green light, and she had watched Gerald Price walked through without a second glance, and something in her chest had assembled itself into a knot that no page of the Summit Airways employee handbook could explain or justify. Carolyn did not look at Avery. Avery looked at the scanner screen, then at the man standing at the podium. And back at the screen, she reached into her jacket pocket, found her phone, pressed record. Not because she was certain about what she was witnessing. Not because she knew where it would lead. But because 3 months ago, she had stood in a different gate area, watching a different version of this same moment, and had said nothing. And had spent the 6 weeks afterward, lying awake at 2 a.m., the same question on a loop, until it wore a groove in her. She had promised herself there would not be a next time. He was this time us. Record, pocket. She kept her face even, kept her hands still. She did not look away. Raymond waited at that podium for 4 forced seconds. He counted internally, without making the counting visible. At 4 minutes and 2 seconds, a second Summit Airways gate agent arrived, looked at the screen, looked at the boarding pass, looked at Carolyn and said, "It's showing valid on my end." Carolyn looked at the screen, then at Raymond. A pause. Once a second. 2. "Fine," she said. "Go ahead." Raymond picked up his boarding pass, said nothing, walked through the jet bridge and into the aircraft, found seat 1A, stowed his backpack, sat down, adjusted the air vent, looked out the window at the afternoon light flattening over the tarmac. 12 minutes, he thought. Give it 12. It took 11. He was looking at the window when he heard her voice behind him, not rushing, not raised. The particular calm of someone who has rehearsed the words until they no longer need to be thought about. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience, but this seat has been reallocated due to a technical error on our booking system. We have an excellent seat available in our economy cabin, fully complimentary." Raymond turned around. Carolyn Voss stood in the aisle, hands clasped. The face that flight attendants develop somewhere around month 2 of training. Professionally sympathetic, regretful but resolved. The expression specifically designed to make disagreement feel unreasonable. Behind her, at a slight distance, Gerald Price was standing in the aisle, still holding his champagne, looking at Raymond the way men look at something they've already categorized. Raymond said quietly, "Show me the log." Carolyn's expression held. "Sir, the booking system." "I know what a booking system is." "Show me the log." A beat. The kind of pause that happens when someone is recalculating. "I'm not authorized to display internal system logs to passengers." "Then get someone who is." Brendan Shaw appeared from the direction of the gagly, 29 years old, Texas. The specific confidence that develops in people who have been told they're good at their zizbobs by people who needed them to believe it. He moved into the space between Raymond and the aisle with the manner of someone arriving to do you a favor. "Hey, sir, we want to make this as smooth as possible. There's a great seat in row 14. Plenty of. I didn't ask about row 14. I understand, but I asked to see the log." Brendan stopped, looked at Carolyn, a look that said, "Which direction from here?" The intercom clicked. "This is Captain Frank Draper. We apologize for the brief delay. We'll have everyone settled shortly." Footsteps from the cockpit corridor. Frank Draper was 54 years old, 23 years with Summit Airways. The particular bearing of a man whose career had been built doing things correctly directly and in the correct order, which had as a side effect produced an exceptional capacity for not examining too closely whether the correct thing was actually right. He walked up to Raymond's row and looked at him with the expression of a man prepared to be reasonable. "Sir, my crew tells me there's been a booking issue. We're going to get this sorted out." Raymond looked at him steadily. "Who did the sorting?" Frank blinked. "Pardon?" "The reallocation. Did the system initiate it or did a person?" Something shifted in Frank's eyes. A small recalibration. Then it passed, because he had a departure window, and Carolyn had 12 years on this airline, and Raymond was a man in a black polo shirt with a worn backpack, and there was an specific order of things. "My crew will handle this," Frank said. He looked at Carolyn in a way that communicated a permission he had not quite articulated. And Carolyn, who had been watching for exactly that permission, accepted it immediately. She reached out, took Raymond's boarding pass from the tray table where he had set it, and tore it in half. Deliberately, the kind of tear that takes half a second and leaves no question about intention. 3 rows back, Claire Hudson made a sound she hadn't planned. Not a word. The involuntary sound of witnessing something that crosses a line you didn't know was there until you watched someone cross it. She was 38 years old and from Minnesota, and she had been watching since the gate, and her phone had been in her hand for the last 6 minutes. She pressed record. Next to her, Derek Owusu had already started. He was 42 and from Florida, and he had been in enough rooms to know what he was looking at. He said, very low, to Claire, "You getting this?" He said, "Don't stop." She didn't. Carolyn placed the two halves of the boarding pass on the tray table in front of Raymond. "You'll be exiting through the front," she said. "Officer Howell will escort you." Raymond looked at the two pieces of paper. He looked at them for exactly as long as it takes to decide something. Then he looked at Carolyn. "You just destroyed a valid document," he said. "Sir, on a plane you don't own." He paused. In front of witnesses, Carolyn's expression did not change, but something behind it did. She turned to find Officer Deb Howell. Deb Howell had been with airport security for 9 years, 34 years old.
Two kids.
A mortgage on a house she had bought, in a neighborhood where the schools were good, and the commute was manageable, and the monthly payment required her to keep her job with complete consistency. The radio call had come in while she was 2 gates down, gate B9. First-class situation, possible removal. She had walked up the jet bridge with her hand on her radio, and her stomach doing something her face refused to acknowledge. Now she stood in the forward aisle of Summit 412 and looked at the man in seat 1A. He was not doing anything that any reasonable person would describe as a disturbance. He was sitting, completely still. Not aggressive, not agitated, not producing any observable behavior that the word removal should be attached to. He was looking at the two halves of a boarding pass on his tray table with an expression she would later describe in the statement she wrote that night as a recognition. Not surprise, not anger, recognition. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been here before. Not in this seat, not on this exact plane, but here, this shape of thing. She looked at Carolyn. Carolyn gave her the look. The send that said, "This is your function, not mine. You know what comes next." Deb looked at Raymond. He met her eyes, held them. Not challenging, not frightened, just looking at her just the way someone looks at another person when they're deciding whether to trust them. And they're giving them the space to be worth trusting. Her hand stayed on her radio, but she did not raise it. She was still standing there, not moving in either direction, when Brendan Shawn came to stand near her with the body language of someone hoping that proximity to authority would cover for his own uncertainty. She looked at him sidelong. Then she said very quietly, "Step outside with me for a second." Brendan hesitated. "Now," she said. They moved into the jet bridge. The door pulled behind them. Fluorescent lights. The brushed metal walls with their scuff marks from 10,000 rolling bags. The particular non-place of a jet bridge, existing only to connect one thing to another. Deb looked at him. He looked at the wall. She said, "How many times has she done this?" Not a question. The inflection of someone who already knows there's a number and is waiting for it. He said, "I don't know what you." Brendan, flat, not unkind, just done with the warm-up. "How many times on this base?" He looked at his shoes, a pause that lasted long enough to be its own answer. "5, he said. "That I know about. Could be more." Deb closed her eyes. 1 second, opened them, "And you covered for her." "I didn't." He stopped. "I wasn't the one doing it. You knew and you said nothing." He said nothing, which confirmed it. "Why," she said. He exhaled, long and slow, like something he'd been holding. "She knows about something from last year. A situation. She made it clear she'd use it if I caused problems." Deb looked at him steadily. "So she's been holding that over you." He looked at the scuff marks on the wall. "It's not like I wanted to." "I'm not asking what you wanted. I'm asking what you did." She gave him a moment with that. "And what you're going to do now." He was quiet. "Here's where we are," Deb said. "There's a passenger in that cabin who has a valid ticket that someone tore in half. There's footage of it. There are witnesses. Whatever happened before tonight is going to come out in any investigation that follows. You can be the person who was coerced into silence and then came forward, or you can be the person who was coerced into silence and stayed there." She waited. Those are two different things to be. Brendan stared at the wall. She waited 6 seconds. She counted. At 6, he said. Denver was October last year. Couple in their late 40s, both black, first-class tickets, booked under their own names. Carolyn told them there was a double booking and moved them to economy row 18. I saw the log before she changed it. The seats weren't double booked. Deb pulled out her notepad. Keep going, she said. And Brendan Shaw, who had been carrying 14 months of silence like ballast, started talking. In the galley on the other side of the plane, Avery Fields heard the jet bridge door close and did not know what was happening outside it. What she knew was what she could hear through the gap in the galley curtain that she had not quite closed. She knew the man in 1A had not moved. She knew the security officer had gone to the jet bridge, Brendan. She knew Carolyn was standing near the front of the cabin with the tablet in her hand and her attention, somewhere between the screen and the aisle. And she knew, in the way that you know things before you can prove them, that what was happening on that tablet was not a correction. It was a deletion. She pressed herself back against the galley wall, checked her phone. The voice memo showed 31 minutes and counting. She opened a second app, found a contact she had added to her phone 3 months ago, after the woman in October. A journalist based in Atlanta named Renee Bradford, who had written 2 detailed pieces about treatment disparities on major American carriers and had left her contact information in a public forum post that Avery had bookmarked and never deleted. She typed, Gate B9, Summit 412, Chicago right now. I have audio from the start. Pressed send, set the phone back in her pocket, screen down. Stood very still, and waited to find out what the next few minutes would cost her. Raymond Holt was on the phone. Low. Not performing the call for the room, just talking, in the measured register of someone reporting facts to a person they trust to do something with them. Dana, he said, what does the log show? Dana Cole's voice came through the earpiece without preamble. She had been watching the dashboard since Raymond had boarded at 5:04 p.m. She had seen the seat status for Meridian Group 1A show active and confirmed. She had watched it hold for 11 minutes. At 6:19, it changed. The booking entry for Meridian Group in 1A was removed at 6:19 p.m. She said, not flagged, not archived, deleted. The action came from a crew device. I have the device ID. Raymond said, whose device? Registered it to Carolyn Voss. He was quiet for a moment, screenshot the log. Timestamp included. Send it to James, Helen, and Robert right now. Already sent. I sent it the moment I saw the deletion, 6:22 p.m. They have it. Good. Raymond, her voice shifted, not from professional to personal exactly, but from operational to something adjacent to concern. The board is going to want to move. Tell them to hold. They're not going to like. Tell them I asked for time to handle it directly. They'll have everything they need within the hour. A pause. James said he'd give you until the plane started moving. Raymond looked out the window, the tarmac below Gate B9. Jet bridge still attached. Nothing moving. Tell him it hasn't moved, Raymond said. He knows, Dana said. He's watching Claire Hudson's stream. Raymond absorbed that, said nothing. Do you want me to? No. Let it run. He looked at the torn boarding pass on his tray table. Let everything run. He ended the call. Set the phone face up on the tray beside the 2 halves of the boarding pass. Frank Draper was still standing in the aisle. He had been standing there since he'd given Carl the permission she'd been waiting for. And in the minutes since, something had shifted in the set of his expression. He was looking at the tablet in Carolyn's hands with the attention of someone who has started to notice that what he's looking at and what he was told he's looking at are not the same shape. Raymond said, Captain. Frank looked at him. Has anyone shown you the booking log? Frank opened his mouth, closed it. Has anyone actually pulled up the seat history for 1A and let you look at it yourself? A pause. Because if the answer is no, Raymond continued, then everything you've agreed to in the last 8 minutes has been based on person's account of what the system shows. And I'd think that after 23 years, you'd want to look at the actual record before you act on a description of it. Frank's jaw tightened, but he turned to Carolyn, And Raymond watched Frank's eyes do the thing eyes do. When a mind is revising a conclusion, it had already filed. "Show me the log," Frank said. Carolyn's composure held, but it shifted. The smallest possible shift, invisible to someone not watching for it. "Captain, the system shows. Carolyn." His voice had changed, still controlled, but different. The difference between a machine's coasting and one that has changed gears. "Show me the log." She looked at him for one moment. Then she turned the tablet to face him. Frank looked at the screen. His face did not change expression, but his eyes moved the way eyes move when someone is seeing a blank where a name should be and understanding what that blank means. An absence with a shape, a deletion, not an error. Carolyn reached out and turned the tablet face down on the seat back tray. The cabin registered that. Not with sound, with the quality of attention a room gives to a gesture that cannot be walked back. Frank Draper straightened slowly. He looked at Raymond. Raymond looked at him. No performance in either direction. Just two people across the distance of what had just happened. 4 rows back, Derek Owusu said, barely audible. "She turned the screen over." Claire said, "I saw." "Tell me you got that." "I got it." "Okay," Derek said. He exhaled. "Okay," Raymond said quietly. "You saw it." Frank said nothing. "You saw what wasn't there," Raymond said. "And you saw her close it." Frank stood in the aisle of his aircraft with 23 years behind him and tablet boarding pass in his peripheral vision and a tablet face down on a tray table and a camera 3 rows back that he didn't know was feeding a stream now at 6,400 viewers. He stood there, and the version of events that required the least from him became something he could no longer hold in the shape he'd been holding it. Walter Gaines had been in row 14 for 23 minutes. He had boarded during economy boarding. No complications. No one had stopped him or questioned his boarding pass, or looked at him the way people look at things that don't belong. He had found his seat, stored his small carry-on in the overhead, and settled in with the ease of a man who has sat in a great many airplane seats and has no particular feelings about which one. He opened his book. He was not reading it. He was listening to the sounds from the front of the aircraft. Not straining, just present to them. The compressed quality of voices in a contained spaces. The particular register of a situation developing under the surface of professional calm. He had spent 41 years in classrooms, and he knew the sound of something that needed to be heard, being ignored by the people with the authority to hear it. He turned a page. Noticed a woman in the row ahead of him, late 50s, who had given up all pretense of looking at her magazine and was now simply turned slightly toward the front of the plane with the unguarded attention of someone caught on the pull of something they didn't ask to be part of. The man next to her, younger, had his phone out. On the other side of the aisle, a couple was whispering to each other. She was watching something on her phone. He was watching the front of the cabin. Both of them had the focused stillness of people who have made a decision. Walter looked out the small oval window. The tarmac below the terminal was still holding the last of the afternoon light in the way flat surfaces hold it, carrying it longer than the sky does. Somewhere out there, planes were moving through the beginning of evening with no awareness of what was happening inside Gate B9. He thought about a phone call he'd made 4 months ago to Raymond. Not because he'd expected anything to come of it. He had not expected that. He had called because Raymond had given him his direct number years ago at an event that Walter had attended as a guest of someone who knew Raymond's chief of staff, and Raymond had said, "If you ever need anything, call me directly." I mean that. Walter had not called in 6 years. When he finally did, he hadn't called about needing anything. He had called because he thought Raymond knew about what had happened on one of his planes. Because Walter Gaines had spent his whole career teaching young people that when you know something and the knowing requires action, the actions is not optional. He had not expected Raymond to answer on the second ring. He had not expected Raymond to go very quiet in the way people go quiet when they're not spacing out but paying the most complete attention they have. He had definitely not expected Raymond to say, at the end of the call, "I'm going to fix this. It's going to take a few months, but I'm going to fix it." Walter had said, "You don't need to do anything on my account." Raymond said, "I know." There had been a pause. Then Raymond had said, "How are you doing, Walter?" And Walter had thought about his son, about a seat in Economy Row 22, about a funeral in Los Angeles, and the specific quality of grief that is made worse by being made small at the same time. He had said, "I'm getting there." Raymond had said, "I know you are." Now Walter sat in row 14 of Summit 4112 and listened to something from the front of the plongeon and thought, whatever Raymond is doing up there, he's been planning it for a while. He turned another page he wasn't reading and let it run. Back in first class, Avery Fields had heard the jet bridge door and watched Howell return through the forward door. Without Brendan, with her notepad open and a look on her face that was different from the look she'd had going out. Something had been decided in that jet bridge. Avery watched Deb walk to the forward galley, take out her radio and make a call. Not for backup, not to initiate removal. The words Avery caught, standing near the galley gap. Record request. Summit 412, Gate B9. Flag it for compliance. And note that a crew member has additional information. Avery stood very still. Then she looked at her own phone. The response from Renee Bradford had come in while she'd been watching. 5 words. "Still here. Keep it running." Avery exhaled, tucked the phone back in her pocket, kept running. Rayson sat in seat 1A with his phone face up on the tray and the boarding pass beside it, and the window showing him an airport doing the steady, unhurried work of moving people across distances. He was not impatient. He had learned, across a lifetime of waiting in rooms where the rules applied differently to him than to the person next to him, that impatience was information you gave to the wrong people. He kept his information. He looked at the boarding pass, 2 halves, a clean tear, he thought. She has done this before. The certainty with which she tore it, the absence of hesitation. You've liked that the first time. He thought, 5 times on this base. That's what Dana's cross-reference had shown before he'd boarded. 5 complaints in 8 months. All routed through the same customer relations channel, all returned as form letters within 30 to 40 days, all closed without investigation. He thought about the 6th, the one that had started all of this, the one that had come in 11 months ago from a man named Walter Gaines, routed through the same channel, closed the same way. He thought, not again, not on this flight, not one more time. Frank Draper appeared at the edge of the galley curtain. He had been in the back galley for 4 minutes. He came back looking like a man who had made a decision he was not entirely at peace with and had decided to make it anyway because the alternative was worse. He walked up to Raymond's seat, did not stand over him, crouched slightly, at a level that made the conversation less of a confrontation. He said, "I'm going to call the main office." Raymond said, "Good. I'm going to ask them to verify the entity behind the Meridian Group booking." Raymond said, "Ask them directly. Don't route it through the ticketing desk." Frank held his gaze. Why not? Because the ticketing desk on this base talks to Carolyn. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. He straightened, walked to the forward area, pulled out his personal phone, not the crew line, dialed a number directly. Raymond picked up his phone, called Dana. She answered on the first ring. He said, "Captain's making the call," she said. "I know. I can see the operations log updating." A pause. Raymond, Yeah, you've been on this plane for 47 minutes. I know. The board has been in session for 31 of them. I know. James wants you to know that when this becomes public, and it is going to become public. It already is, Raymond said. How many viewers? A beat. 9,200. Raymond set the phone on his knee. 9,000 people watching a man sit in a seat, he thought. And the people who weren't watching. The people who had sat in this seat, or a seat like it, with no cameras in row 4, and no live stream and no board in emergency session. The people who had taken their complaint and sent it through the channel and gotten the letter back and absorbed what the letter meant about their value to the institution that had sent it. He thought, that is who I am here for. Frank Draper's voice from the forward area had gone very still. Raymond turned. Frank was holding his phone at his side. He was looking at the floor of the aircraft for the space of one full breath. Then he raised his head and walked back to seat 1A with the expression of a man who has just had a room rearranged around him and is still adjusting to the new dimensions. He looked at Raymond. Raymond looked back. Frank said, "You own this airline." Raymond said, 30% of it. Frank said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know." Raymond said, "I know you didn't." "If I had, don't," Raymond said. Frank stopped. "Whatever you were about to say after that," Raymond said, "I don't want to hear it. Because it doesn't matter. What I need you to think about right now is not who I am. It's what would have happened if I were anyone else." Frank Draper stood in the aisle of his aircraft and thought about that. The cabin, which had been holding itself in a kind of suspended tension for the last 40 minutes, held itself a little more. Nobody moved, and in row 14, Walter Gaines turned to the window. The tarmac had gone fully gray. The day was done. He folded the corner of his page, closed the book, and waited for whatever came next. The cabin had a quality of stillness now, not the stillness of people minding their own business. The stillness of people who have stopped minding their own business entirely and are paying the most complete attention they have to something happening 6 feet ahead of them. Frank Draper stood in the aisle next to seat 1A. He had said, "You own this airline." Raymond had said, "Don't." And Frank was standing there with the full of what don't meant settling across his shoulders like something physical. Because don't meant the fact that I own it is not the point. Don't meant what you should be thinking about is not who I turned out to be. Don't meant. Imagine I was nobody. Frank was trying to imagine that. It was harder than it should have been. And the difficulty itself was information. He looked at Carolyn Voss. She was standing near the forward bulkhead with her tablet held against her chest and her expression in the configuration she had trained it to hold in difficult passenger situations. Managed, contained. The face of someone who believes the situation is still controllable, because controlled situations are the only kind she has ever found herself in. She had not yet understood that this one stopped being controllable at 8 p.m. when a 22-year-old trainee pressed record at the gate. Frank said, "Carolyn, give me the tablet." Her expression shifted microscopically. "Captain, the operational records on this device are crew only and the protocol for, give me the tablet." A pause. She held it out. He took it. Did not look at the screen immediately. Just held it. Looked at Carolyn for a moment, with the expression of a man revising his long-held conclusion about a person he thought he knew. Then he turned the screen on and looked at the seat log for 1A. The leash is visible even to someone who didn't know exactly what they were looking at. A gap where continuity should have been. An entry at 5:04 p.m. showing Meridian Group confirmed in seat 1A. Then nothing. No transfer, no system flag, no archived record of a change. Just the entry and then the absence of the entry and a top sign of the absence that read 6:19 p.m. 11 minutes after Raymond had taken his seat. Frank looked at the device ID attached to the action. He recognized the crew tablet's serial prefix. He looked at Carolyn. She was watching him look at it. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Frank said very quietly, "How long?" Not a question about tonight. The inflection made that clear. How long, as in, how long has this been happening? How long have I been standing in aisles, giving crew permission I didn't verify? Carolyn said. This was a judgment call based on, how long, Carolyn? She looked at the seat back of 1B, then at the floor, then at a point somewhere between them. That wasn't anything. "I've been with this airline for 12 years, she said, which was not an answer, which they both knew was not an answer. He handed the tablet to Deb Howell, who had come back into the forward cabin from the jet bridge and was standing near the galley entrance with her notepad and the settled salve someone who has just completed a task she hadn't anticipated and is ready for what comes next. "I need you to hold this for compliance," Frank said. Deb took it without comment, placed it in her bag, sealed the bag. Carolyn watched that happen. Something crossed her face. Not the managed expression, something underneath it. The look of someone's wanted a door close that they had believed, until this moment they still had the key to. Raymond had not spoken since he'd told Frank, "Don't." He had been watching, not with satisfaction, not with the released tension of someone watching a situation resolve in their direction. With the care of someone who knows that a situation resolving in your direction is not the same as the situation being resolved. There was still a great deal to resolve. He looked at the live view counter on the streaming app Dana had sent him the link to. 11,400. He put the phone face down on the tray table. Some things didn't need numbers attached to them. Gerald Price cleared his throat. He was in 1B, where he had sat for the past 37 minutes without moving, without speaking, and with the concentrated stillness of someone who has decided that the least visible version of himself is the safest available option. The champagne his tray table had gone flat. He hadn't touched it since approximately 6:24 p.m. He said, "I think," he stopped. Raymond turned to look at him. Gerald's wife Susan was beside him in 1C. She had not filmed anything, had not said anything, but she had not looked away for the last 20 minutes. Her hand rested on her husband's arm. Not comfort, exactly. More like grounding, keeping him present to what was happening around him. Gerald tried again. "We didn't know," he said. "When Carolyn offered us the seats, we didn't ask why they were available." Raymond looked at him. "I know that doesn't." Gerald paused. Recalibrated. "I know that's not the same as not being part of it." Raymond said nothing. "We should have asked," Gerald said. It was not a complete sentence, not an apology that arrived fully formed, but it was real. Frank could hear the difference between a real thing and a performance of a real thing, and this was real. Raymond said, "You're right." Gerald absorbed that. Susan said quietly to her husband, "I told you." Not accusatory, just true. The truth that lives between two people who have been together long enough that those three words carry history. Gerald nodded. He looked at his flat champagne, then pushed the tray table up and latched it. The champagne out of sight. A small acknowledgement. The beginning of something that didn't yet know its full shape. Claire Hudson had been holding her phone up for 29 minutes. Her arm had started communicating its objections somewhere around minute 14. The specific burn that lives between shoulder and elbow when you've been holding something up past the point body expected. She had shifted her grip twice, changed the angle slightly, kept the frame on seat 1A, because the frame was the point. She was 38 years old, and she had spent most of her adult life in situations where the right thing and the easy thing were different. And she had not always chosen the right one, and she had developed across those years a fairly specific intolerance for her own silence. So when she'd watched Carolyn Voss stop Raymond at the gate and she'd felt the recognition, because you do recognize it, she knew she did, in a specific way that came from growing up in rooms where certain people were managed differently. She had not thought about it. She had picked up her phone, and she had pressed record, and she had kept the camera steady. She had 4,200 followers on the platform where she was streaming, which was not many, which had not mattered, because the number had passed 4,000 and kept going while she was focused on keeping the frame steady. And at some point, Derek had started quietly giving her updates that she was only half receiving, because the other half of her attention was on the man in 1A who had not raised his voice once in the last half hour. Derek said, 14,000. Claire said, "Don't tell me numbers. People are sharing it." I know. Claire, there are accounts with like 200,000 followers sharing your stream. Derek, "Yeah, I know. I just need to not think about that right now. He understood that. He went quiet. She kept the frame on seat 1A. What she was watching was not a dramatic scene in the conventional sense. Raymond Holt was not yelling. He was not crying. He was not performing outrage for the camera or building to any visible crescendo. He was sitting in a seat he had paid for, watching the people around him with the specific calm of someone who has been in a long game before and understands that the long game requires you to stay in your body, which was, somehow, more devastating to watch than any of the alternatives, because the alternatives would have made it easier to dismiss. Rowena Ash, in seat 5A, had given up all pretense of looking at her book. She was 64 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Indianapolis, traveling to visit her daughter in Los Angeles. She had watched the whole thing from the moment Carolyn had appeared in the aisle. She had not filmed. Her phone was in her bag, and she had made a decision early on that she was not going to be someone who watched a thing like this through a screen instead of with her actual eyes. She was watching with her actual eyes, and what she was watching was making her think about her son, about a situation 3 years ago in a hotel lobby in Atlanta, about the way certain rooms reacted to certain people, about the exhaustion of being the person who has to decide every single time whether the thing that just happened was the thing it looked like or whether you're misreading it. She had spent a long time training herself not to be sure, because being sure was costly and exhausting and almost never led anywhere useful. But watching Raymond Holt in seat 1A, she was sure. The man in 7B, Marcus Webb, 45, a contracts attorney from Seattle who had taken this flight 6 times in the last 2 years and had never spoken to anyone beyond pleasantries, leaned forward slightly. He was watching Frank Draper. Specifically, he was watching the shift in Frank's posture across the last several minutes. The way Frank's body language had changed from the body language of a man managing a situation to the body language of a man being managed by one. Webb had spent 20 years in rooms where that distinction mattered. He recognized the shift. He looked at his seatmate, a woman he'd exchanged maybe 12 words with since boardroom, and said, "The captain just understood something." She looked at him. "What? I'm not sure yet," he said. "But watch his hands." She watched his hands. They were very still. The stillness of someone who has stopped gesturing because the gestures they had available no longer fit what they're trying to communicate. In row 6, a man named Donald Prater, 68, retired Air Force, had his arms crossed and his jaw set and had been sitting that way since Carolyn tore the boarding pass. He was not filming. He was not speaking. He was watching with the specific expression of someone who has seen command structure abused before and has a very low tolerance for it and is deciding what to do with that intolerance. He hadn't decided yet, but he was getting there. Avery Fields was not still, internally. Externally, she was doing the thing she had done since the moment she pressed record at the gate, or was maintaining the outward presentation of someone who is going about their professional function while internally running approximately 6 separate processes at once. Process 1. The voice memo, 44 minutes and counting. Process 2. Renee Bradford's message. Still here, keep it running. Which Avery had read 4 times, and which had produced each time a sensation she could only describe as being caught before you fell. Process 3. The conversation she had overheard between Deb Howell and Brendan in the jet bridge. She had not heard all of it. Enough. Enough to know that Brendan had said something, and that what he'd said had changed Deb's posture when she came back in. Process 4. The tablet. The way Frank had taken it, the way Deb had put it in her bag, the way Carolyn had watched that happen. Process 5. Her mother, who did not know what her daughter was doing right now, and who, when she found out, was going to experience approximately 48 hours of retroactive terror before arriving at something that might eventually become pride. Process 6. The question she had been running since 6:08 p.m. The question of what she owed. Not to Raymond specifically, not to the passengers in rows 4 through 8 with their cameras. But to the woman in October, the one in the blazer, who had ended up in row 17, who had never known Avery's name, who had gotten on that plane and been diminished by it, and had no idea that a 21-year-old trainee had watched it happen and filed an informal concern note that went nowhere. Avery owed her something. She owed her the version of tonight where Avery did not flinch. She stepped out of the galley. Carolyn was in the forward area between the gaggaluggy and the first-class curtain, standing with the particular quality of someone whose options are narrowing and who hasn't yet found the version of narrowing that looks like a choice. She looked at Avery. Avery looked back. "You should be in the galley," Carolyn said. "I've been in the galley," Avery said. "This situation is being handled." "I know." Avery walked to where she could see Raymond in 1A. "Mr. Holt." Raymond turned. "The recording I started at the gate," she said. "I want you to know it's been running continuously. I didn't stop it when you identified yourself. I didn't stop it when Captain Draper took the tablet." Carolyn said, "Fields, 44 minutes of audio," Avery said. "From the gate through right now." Raymond said, "Who have you sent it to?" She said, "A journalist, Atlanta-based. She covers airline industry practices. She responded 4 minutes after I reached out." Carolyn's voice dropped. "That is a direct violation of crew confidentiality." "The confidentiality policy," Avery said, turning to face her, "covers cockpit voice systems and operational communications, not personal device recordings made to document a potential civil rights violation." She stopped. I looked it up. 3 months ago. After the woman in October." A silence. Not empty. Dense. Carolyn said. "You don't know what happened in October." "Row 17, Avery said. First-class ticket. The seat became available shortly after she boarded." She held Carolyn's eyes. "I know what I watched. I filed a concern note. It was closed in 11 days, with no finding." Frank Draper had turned around from where he'd been standing near the bulkhead. He was looking at Avery with the expression of a man taking inventory of everything he had and had not known about his own crew. The inventory was taking longer than he'd expected. He said, "Fields, what's your employee number?" Avery said it. He wrote it down, not as a threat. She could hear the difference. He was writing it down because he was going to need it for the report he was going to spend the rest of this night writing and the rest of this week delivering. He was writing it down because it was going to matter that she was documented as having acted. She said, "The journalist is Renee Bradford. She's been following the stream from row 4. Frank looked at Claire Hudson. Claire lowered her phone slightly, raised it again. Frank said, "How many viewers?" Claire looked at her screen, said, 16,000. Frank turned back to the front of the cabin. He said to nobody in particular, "Lord." Raymond Holt was on the phone. Dana had sent a brief message first. Board confirmed all 3 received the log evidence. "James says DT contact already in motion. Do you want me to hold the announcement until you give the word?" Raymond typed back, "Hold the announcement. Don't hold anything else." Dana responded, "Understood." He set the phone on the tray table, looked at the torn boarding pass. 2 halves, a clean line through the middle. He picked both up, held them in one hand, not attempting to realign them, not pressing the edges together, just holding. The weight of them was nothing, a few grams of paper. And yet he set them back down. Carolyn Voss was in the jump seat near the forward galley. Frank had told her to sit. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and the managed expression showing its first signs of genuine strain. The edges fraying. The places where 12 years of professional composure was meeting something composure was not built to handle. Raymond looked at her. She felt the look and did not return it. He thought about what it would cost her. Professionally, legally. The federal investigation already in motion, set moving by an email from Dana Cole at 6:22 p. Asked on a device ID, a timestamp, and a deletion that had seemed, at 6:19 p.m. when she'd made it, like a clean solutions to a straightforward problem. He thought about 5 passengers on this base. He thought about the woman in October. He thought about Walter Gaines in row 14, who had saved 3 months of retirement income for a seat on this airline, and had been moved to economy row 22, and had flown to his son's funeral in a middle seat between strangers without anyone from Summit Airways ever saying his name again after the complaint was filed. He thought, the cost of what she did is not mine to decide, but the pattern that produced it is mine to stop. Frank Draper appeared at the edge of the galley entrance. He had his personal notepad, small, breast pocket size. He had been writing in it since he'd come back from the back galley. He said to Raymond, I'm going to give a voluntary statement to the compliance team. Everything from the gate call to right now. My account, not filtered through operational language. Raymond said, including what you agreed to before you looked at the log. Frank held his gaze, including that. Raymond nodded. Frank said, I've been flying for 23 years. I know. I should have looked at the log first. That's the baseline. Before anything else, I should have looked. Raymond said, you're right. Frank absorbed that without flinching. What happens to me now, he said. Not a plea. A factual question from a man who has decided to be accurate rather than managed. Raymond said, I don't know yet. But what you do in the next hour matters as much as what you did in the last one. Frank nodded once, went back to his notepad. In row 14, Walter Gaines heard the quality of the sounds from first-class change again. He had been tracking the changes the way a musician tracks key changes, not consciously, just present to them. The first shift had been when the situation escalated, voices compressing with the tightness of a confrontation being held inside professional language. The second had been when something cracked. He'd felt that one more than heard it. The third was this, a settling. Weight redistributed. Something had moved, not resolved, but moved. He looked at his book. He thought about a classroom. Not any specific one, but the composite of 41 years of them. Late afternoon light through institutional windows, young people in rows with varying degrees of willingness to be there, and the work of finding the ones pretending not to be interested and making the material interesting enough that the pretending became untenable. Raymond had been one of the pretenders. 17 years old, second row from the back lap. The row chosen by students who wanted to follow the material, but needed to maintain plausible detachment. He had done the work with a thoroughness he tried to make look accidental. He had asked questions disguised as challenges, which Walter had recognized immediately, because he had seen that disguise hundreds of times, and it always came from the students who cared the most. He had kept Raymond after class one day in November, not for discipline, to say, see what you're doing. You don't have to pretend. Raymond had looked at him with the expression of someone caught at something, and not yet sure whether being caught was safe. Walter had said, the question isn't whether things are fair, they're not. The question is what you do with the knowledge that they're not. Raymond had said, that seems like a lot of work. Walter had said, yes, welcome to the rest of your life. Are you going to do it? Raymond had looked at him for a long moment, then said, yeah. Walter had believed him. He had been right to believe him. The row ahead of Walter had a woman named Patricia, 61, traveling alone, who had been watching the live stream on her phone since she'd found the link on her feed. The strange experience of watching her own plane on her phone while sitting inside it. She had a complicated feeling about the absurdity of this that she did not try to resolve. The man next to her had fallen asleep somewhere around 6:20 p.m. and had not woken up. Patricia had looked at him twice with a feeling that was equal parts envy and bewilderment. In the row behind Walter, a woman and her daughter, maybe 7 years old, had been managing with snacks and a coloring book for the last hour. The daughter kept looking toward the front of the plane with the frank curiosity of a child who knows the adults are paying attention to something unusual and wants to know what. The mother kept saying, "Look at your coloring, baby." The daughter kept looking forward. The mother looked too. They all looked. Raymond Holt appeared at the economy curtain at 6:53 p.m. He did not announce himself, walked down the aisle without hurrying, without performing anything. Row 12. Oh, row 13. Row 14. He stopped, looked at the middle seat, empty since the passengers who had been there moved to an open seat further back sometime in the last 40 minutes. The vacancy felt less like a coincidence, more like the story had been arranging its own space. Raymond sat down. Walter Gaines looked up from his book. He closed it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Walter said, "How long have you been planning this?" Raymond said, "The investigation started in January. The booking for tonight was 11 days ago, because of my complaint, because of what happened to you. And because of what happened to the woman in October, and the couple in Denver, and the man in Miami." He paused. "Your complaint started it. You're not the only reason." Walter looked at the seat back in front of him. "I didn't expect you to do anything," he said. "I know. When I called you, I called because I thought you should know. Not because I expected." "I know," Raymond said again. Walter was quiet. "Then my seat was 4A on that flight. I'd saved 3 months to buy it." He stopped, reconsidered the sentence. "I wanted to get there in a way that felt like something. Like I was going to something that mattered." Raymond said nothing. "They told me there was a double booking." Walter's voice was even. Not performing composure. Genuinely composed, the way of someone who has had 11 months to arrive there. A very polite young woman. She was so sorry. She had a lovely seat for me in row 22, all very smooth, very professional. He paused. "I sat in row 22 for 4 hours and 20 minutes. I landed in Los Angeles and got in a car and went to my son's funeral and never said a word about it at the service because it seemed small. What happened on the plane seemed so small against what I was going to." Raymond said, "It wasn't small." "No," Walter said, "it wasn't. A beat." "I'm sorry," Raymond said. "I should have found the complaint faster. The system buried it in a category that required manual retrieval, and I should have had better oversight on that. That's on me." Walter looked at him. "You found it," he said. "That's not enough." "No, but it's where tonight started." He looked toward the window, where the evening had settled into full dark. "What happens now?" Raymond said. "The audit starts tomorrow. Every base, every complaint in the last 3 years that was closed without investigation. And there's a program I want to build. Training initiative, 48 bases. What dignity looks like not as a policy, but as a practice. Something crew members carry into every cabin." Walter said, "You want to name it after me?" Raymond said, "The Gaines Standard." A silence. Walter looked at the seat back for a long time. Then, "That's a lot of weight to put on a retired teacher's name." Raymond said, "You can take it." Walter said, "What does it actually do, in practical terms?" Raymond said, "It starts with a question, one you ask every year on the first day of class." Walter turned to look at him. "Who in this room is being asked to work harder than everyone else, just to be treated like everyone else?" Walter went very still. "And then it asks the next question," Raymond said. "What are you going to do about it?" The quiet between them had a different quality than the quiet at the beginning of the evening. This quiet had history in it. 41 years of it. A classroom in November. A 17-year-old pretending not to care. A man who saw through the pretending and chose to say so. Walter Gaines looked at Raymond for a long moment. Then he said, "You remembered that." Raymond said, "I remember everything you taught me." Walter said, "You were always pretending not to listen." Raymond said that was the pretending part, and Walter laughed. Quiet, real. The laugh of someone surprised in the best way. The laugh of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just felt a portion of it lift. It did not fill the cabin, but it filled the specific space between two people in row 14, and the woman in the row ahead turned around to look, and what she saw forced her smile without knowing exactly why, because real laughter in an unexpected moment is contagious regardless of context. The daughter in the row behind said, "Mama, that man is laughing." The mother looked, said, "Yeah, baby, he is." The daughter considered this, went back to her coloring book. Raymond sat in the middle seat of row 14 and let the laugh finish. Then he said, I need to ask you something. Walter said, oh, all right, the program, the Gain Standard. I want you to be part of building it. Not in name only, actually part of it. You spent 41 years teaching people how to ask the right questions. I need someone who knows how to build that into a practice. He paused. If you're willing. Walter was quiet. I'm 71 years old, he said. I know, I'm retired, I know. Is there a Los Angeles office? Walter said. Raymond said, 42nd floor. Better view than Chicago. Walter looked at him. Raymond looked back, and something that had been in motion for 41 years arrived at the place it had always been moving toward. Not a destination, a continuation. The understanding that teaching is not a thing that ends when the classroom does, that the questions you put into some 7 at 7 and follow them, into boardrooms and aircraft, and decisions that shape how many people are treated. Walter Gaines said, we'll talk about it. Raymond said, good. He stood up, looked at Walter for one more moment. Then he said, thank you for calling me. Walter said, thank you for answering. Raymond turned and walked back toward the curtain. Walter watched him go. Then he opened his book, and for the first time all evening, he read it. Raymond came back through the curtain at Sepson Lays 2. The first-class cabin registered his return the way rooms register a shift in atmospheric pressure. Not loudly, just a collective adjustment of attention. Heads that had been angled toward phones or windows or the middle distance realigned toward the aisle. He walked to the front, stood in the space between the galley entrance and the first row, looked at the cabin. Not performing the look, not building to anything theatrical, just looking at the people who had been in these seats for the last hour and 15 minutes and had made choices inside that time. The ones who had filmed, the ones who had watched, the ones who had stayed quiet, and the ones who hadn't. The retired Air Force man in row 6, whose arms had stayed crossed, and whose jaw had stayed set, and who had not taken his eyes off the front of the cabin since 6:20. Raymond said, my name is Raymond Holt. The cabin was already quiet. It went quieter. I'm Sam, the CEO of Summit Airways. I hold 30% ownership of this company. Gerald Price made a sound, small and involuntary. The sound of a stomach doing something a face hasn't caught up to. Raymond did not look at him. I booked seat 1A 11 days ago under Meridian Group, which is a Summit Airways subsidiary. I've done this 4 times before. Dallas, Miami, Denver, Seattle. I've sat in economy sections and first-class cabins on my own airline and documented how passengers are treated when the people doing the treating believe no one with authority is present. He paused. Let the cabin hold that. What happened tonight is not the story of a single flight attendant making a bad decision, he said. It's the story of a system that allowed 5 documented incidents on this base alone in the past 8 months without producing a single investigation. 5 complaints, 5 form letters, 5 times a person was moved from seats they purchased and told it was a system error and given a voucher worth less than the dignity that was taken from them. Rowena Ash, in 5A, closed her stores briefly, opened them. Raymond said, that system is mine. I built it and I didn't maintain it correctly. And what happened tonight, Dwight, is the result of that failure compounding across a longer period than I'm comfortable with. He stopped. So I'm saying that plainly. Not in a press statement. Not through a communications team. Here, in this cabin, to the people who were present. Donald Prater in row 6 uncrossed his arms. He had been in the Air Force for 26 years. He had watched commanding officers accept responsibility for institutional failures. He had watched commanding officers avoid it. He knew the difference between the two in the first sentence. This was the first kind. He nodded once. Not to anyone in particular, just to himself. An acknowledgement. Webb, the contract's attorney in 7B, looked at his seatmate. She was looking at Raymond. Webb looked back at Raymond, too. He had spent 20 years in rooms where people said the right things to manage situations, rooms where people said true things to change them. He was listening to the distinction. It was holding up. Raymond looked at Carolyn Voss. She was in the jump seat where Frank had placed her. She had been sitting there for 23 minutes with her hands in her lap and her eyes, finding various neutral surfaces that were not Raymond and not the passengers and not the window, because the window showed her the gate area and the gate area showed her the jet bridge she was going to walk down shortly in a direction she had not been planning when she arrived at O'Hare that afternoon. She felt Raymond's eyes. She did not return the look. He said, "I'm going to speak to Carolyn now, and then I'm going to tell you what comes next." He turned to her, walked to the jump seat, crouched down slightly so the conversation was not conducted over her. Eye level. The way you talk to someone when you want them to understand that you are talking to them specifically and not performing for the room, he said, quietly enough that the cabin could hear, but not easily. "I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself." She said nothing. "I've seen the log. I have the device ID. I have the timestamp. The compliance team has the tablet." Brendan gave a statement. He paused. "There's nothing left to explain." Her hands tightened slightly in her lap. "What I want to know," he said, "is one thing. And I'm asking you to tell me the truth because there's no version of this where the truth makes things worse for you than they already are." She looked at him. For the first time since she'd stopped him at the gate, she actually looked at him. "The woman in October," he said. "The one in the blazer. When you moved her. Did you know you were doing it?" A silence. Long enough that the cabin, which had been trying not to listen, gave up trying and simply listened. Then Carolyn said, "I told myself I didn't." Raymond said, "But you did." She looked at her hands. "Yes," she said. The word cost something. He could see the cost of it on her face. It was not the cost of being caught. It was a different cost. The cost of saying out loud a thing you have been carefully not saying yourself for a very long time. He did not comfort her about the cost. He said, 5 people on this base that you know about." "Yes." "And you understand that the investigation will find the full number?" "Yes." He stood up, looked at her for one more moment. Then he said, "You're going to cooperate fully with the compliance team and the federal investigators. Everything you know about the pattern on this base and any other base you have knowledge of." She said. "Yes," he said. "That's the last conversation I'm going to have you directly." He turned back to the cabin. Frank Draper was standing near the galley entrance with his notepad and the expression of a man who is writing things down with the understanding that what he writes is going to be read by people with the authority to end a 23-year career. Rain walked to him. Frank looked up, said, "You've been writing." "Everything," Frank said, "from the gate call. What Carolyn told me. What I agreed to without looking at the log. The moment I saw it. The moment she closed the screen." He paused. "I'm not softening any of it." Raymond said, "Good," Frank said. "I want to ask you something." Raymond waited. "The 5 previous passengers," Frank said. "The ones on this base. Was I involved in any of them?" Raymond looked at him. "Were you on those flights?" Frank said, "I was on 2 of them. The Denver couple and the woman in March." Raymond said, "Were you in the cabin when the reallocation happened?" "I was called down both times. Same as tonight. Carolyn's account, booking error, non-compliant passenger." He stopped. "I agreed both times." Raymond absorbed that. Frank said, "I need you to know that I understand what that means." Raymond said, "What does it mean?" "It means I wasn't passive. Passive would be not being there. I was there, and I agreed to something I should have questioned." He held Raymond's gaze. "That's not the same as what Carolyn did, but it's also not nothing." Raymond said, "No, it's not." Frank looked his notepad. "It's in here, all 3 instances I was present for. My account unfiltered." Raymond said, "The compliance team is going to want to speak with you before the flight departs." Frank said, "I know. I'm not going anywhere." Raymond looked at him for a moment. Frank Draper was not a bad man. Raymond had been watching him across the last 90 minutes and had arrived at that conclusion with the same carefulness he applied to any conclusion. Frank was a man who had built a career on procedure and trust, and had never adequately examined the point at which trust becomes complicity, who had stood in aisles and nodded at accounts he'd verify because verification felt like a challenge to authority, and challenging authority was not in his procedural vocabulary. That was not innocence, but it was not the same thing as what Carolyn had done. Raymond said, "You're going to be grounded, pending investigation." Frank said, "I expected that. For how long depends on the findings and on what you contribute to the process." Frank nodded. "Can I ask you something?" Raymond said. Frank said, "Yes. When you called the operations line and they told you who owned Meridian Group, what did you feel?" Frank was quiet for a moment. "Scared," he said. "First and then," he stopped. "And then something else. Something that wasn't about me." He looked at the notepad. "I thought about the couple in Denver, and the woman in March, and tonight. And I thought about how many times I've been in that aisle and nodded at something I should have looked at." And the scared got smaller. He paused. "That's not absolution. I'm not presenting it as absolution." Raymond said, "I know. I'm just answering your question." Raymond said, "The report you're writing, when it's done, send it directly to the board, not through operations." "Direct." Said, "I will." Deb Howell appeared from the forward area where she had been on her radio for the last 12 minutes. She walked to Raymond. She said, "Compliance team is 7 minutes out. 2 investigators. They'll want the tablet, Brendan's state, and first access to the voice memo." Raymond said, "Avery knows. She's ready." Deb paused. "Mr. Holt," he looked at her. She said, "I need to tell you something." He waited. "When I came on board tonight," she said, "when I saw you was in that seat." So was wrong with the situation before Carolyn said a word to me. The way you were sitting. The way she was standing. The specific stopped. "I've been doing this job for 9 years, and I know the shape of a manufactured situation." Raymond said, and I almost acted on what Carolyn told me anyway." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that. Not as a confession that's looking for absolution. Just as a fact that I think you should know." Raymond said, "What stopped you?" She said, "You looked at me like you were giving me space to be worth trusting. And I didn't want to be the person who wasn't." A pause. Raymond said, "You're going to go through the investigation process. Full compliance review. Possible reassignment during the review period." She said, "I know." He said, "What you did in the jet bridge with Brendan, getting his statement documented before the compliance team arrived, that was the right call." Deb said, "It was the obvious call." Raymond said, "Those are usually the same call. People just make them at different speeds." She almost smiled. "Didn't quite," he said. "Thank you for the speed." She nodded. Walked back to the forward area. Raymond's phone buzzed. "Dana." He answered immediately. She said, "Dot confirmed receipt of the log evidence at 6:27 p.m. They opened a preliminary case. The case number was assigned at 649 P. Raymond. This is federal. As of 6:49 tonight." Raymond said, "I know. The board wants to release a statement before midnight. James says anything later and they lose the narrative." Raymond said, "Tell James the narrative is already determined. 23,000 people watched it live." Dana said, "That was the count at 7:05 p.m. It's higher now." Raymond said, "Then tell James the statement can be honest instead of strategic, because the strategy window closed at 6:08 p.m. when a 22-year-old trainee pressed record at the gate." A pause. Dana said, "He's going to love that you said that." Raymond said, "He's going to write a very careful statement that says something close to what I said, but with more legal clearance." Dana said, "Accurate, a beat, the Gaines standard. James wants the framework announced with the statement." Raymond said, "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because Walter Gaines hasn't agreed to anything formally. And I'm not going to announce a program named after a man before I've given him space to decide what his name attached to something means to him." Dana was quiet. Then, "Okay." Raymond said, "Draft the framework. Have it ready. Hold the announcement." Dana said, "Done." A pause. Raymond, "Eastman?" "Yeah," she said. "Are you all right?" The question landed differently than he'd expected. Not the operational version, the actual version. He looked at the first-class cabin. Carolyn in the jump seat. Frank writing in his notepad. Avery in the galley, preparing her phone for the compliance team. Gerald and Susan Preece in 1B and 1C, with the stiffness of people rearranged by an evening, who are still finding out what the new arrangement looks like. He looked at the torn boarding pass. He said, tired, but yes. Dana said, good. Framework in 2 hours. He ended the call. The gate door opened. 2 people in Summit Airways compliance badges came through the jet bridge. Business clothes, not uniforms. The efficiency of people who have been briefed on the route and are walking into a situation they already understand the shape of. Frank Draper met them at the door. Raymond watched Frank shake their hands and begin the process of accounting for the evening with the methodical care of someone who has decided that what he owes the next 2 hours is accuracy. Not the managed version of events, just accuracy. Avery Fields came out of the galley. She walked to the compliance investigators. Said, I'm Avery Fields. I have audio from the gate. The lead investigator looked at her. Said, from when? She said, before he boarded. Running continuously from 6 of 8 p.m. The investigator looked at Raymond. Raymond said, everything she has is yours. Avery handed over the phone. She stood there while the investigator reviewed the audio log. And what she felt, standing in the water of Summit for one wolf, with her wings pinned above her heart, and her phone in a compliance investigator's hands, was not the relief she'd expected. It was quieter than that. The quiet of having done the thing and still being standing. She had thought somewhere across the last 90 minutes that acting might feel a certain way. Clean, vindicating. The way courage is described in the versions of these stories that arrive after the fact, when all the costs are known and the outcome is visible. It did not feel that way. It felt like standing in a first-class cabin at 7 o'clock in the evening, having spent the last hour being considerably more herself than she's managed on the last flight, not knowing yet what that would cost. Having decided, somewhere before the hour mark, that not knowing was acceptable. She looked at Raymond. He looked at her. She said, what happens to me? He said, what do you want to happen? She said, I want to keep flying. He said, then keep flying. She said, it's not that simple. He said, no, but it starts there. She said, is there going to be a review? He said, yes. And you're going to go through it documented as a crew member who acted with integrity on her first assignment. And you're going to be fine. She said, you don't know that, he said. I know what I'm going to say to the review board. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, the journalist, Renee Bradford, she wants to speak with you. Raymond said, I know. He pulled out his phone, found the number Avery had sent him at 5:43 p.m. The same number she'd messaged at the gate, the one that came back, still here. Keep it running. He dialed. Renee Bradford answered on the second ring. She said, Mr. Holt. He said, Mrs. Bradford. She said, I've been following since Avery reached out. I have my own recording from the public stream, as he said. You'll have a full statement from the board by morning. On record. I'll give you 15 minutes on background tonight, she said. I'll take both, he said. Before you write anything, I want you to understand something. She waited, he said. The point is not that the CEO was on the plane. The point is what would have happened if he wasn't. What has happened? 5 times on this base, across the network. To people who had no ownership stake and no compliance team watching their log and no board in session. Who just had a ticket and a seat and the reasonable expectation that those things would be honored. Renee Bradford said, Mr. Holt, I've been covering this industry for 8 years. He said, I know. She said, I know what the point is. He said, good, she said. Will you name them? The 5 passengers on the base. Raymond said, the compliance team reaches out to all 5 in the next 48 hours. If they consent to being named, yes, she said. And the man in economy, the one you went to see. Raymond said, his name is Walter Gaines. Whether his name appears in your story is his decision, she said. Can I speak with him? Raymond looked toward the economy curtain. He said, "I'll ask him." Carolyn was off Summit 412 at 7:23 p.m. The compliance investigators had spoken to her for 9 minutes in the back alley. The conversation had been brief because there was not much she could add to what the log, the device ID, the voice memo, and Brendan's statement had already established. She had answered the questions she was asked. She had not volunteered anything beyond the questions. Her lawyer, when she called one, would tell her that was the correct instinct. She gathered her bag. She walked through the first-class cabin with the gate agents on either side and her uniform still on because there was nowhere to change and no version of the walk that was going to be different, regardless of what she was wearing. She did not look at Raymond. She did not look at Gerald Price or Susan or Claire Hudson or Derek Owusu or Rowena Ash or Donald Prutter or any of the row after row of people who had watched this evening accumulate from the moment she'd stopped Raymond at the gate. At the galley entrance, she stopped. Avery was standing there, the two of them in the narrow space, less than 3 feet between them. Carolyn looked at Avery. Avery looked at Carolyn. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that would improve on the silence. What was between them was complicated and unfinished, and was going to take considerably longer than this moment to become whatever it was going to become. But Avery did not look away, and Carolyn did not rush through the space. They held it. 1 second, 2. Then Carolyn walked up the jet bridge. Avery watched her go. She stood there for a moment after the gate door closed. Then she turned around and went back to work. Brendan Shaw had left 15 minutes earlier, during the compliance investigators' first round with the tablet. He had gone quietly, without drama, and without the particular performance of remorse that would have been less convincing than the absence of performance. He had taken his bag and walked, and he had not looked at anyone specifically, and not said anything beyond the procedural exchanges required to complete his exit. He was 29 years old. He had a statement on record that was honest about what he'd done and what he'd known and how long he'd known it. That statement was going to matter in ways he couldn't fully calculate yet. Some of those ways were going to be hard. He understood that. The understanding showed in the way he walked. Outside got B9, the terminal was doing what terminals do at 7:30 in the evening, moving people toward departures and away from arrivals with the steady, indifferent efficiency of a system designed to process volume. Gate agents at adjacent gates were running their boarding calls. The overhead announcements cycled through flight numbers and delay notifications. Somewhere in the food court, a child was crying and being comforted. Carolyn stood near the windows that faced the tarmac. One of the gate agents was with her, waiting for the formal escort to the operations office that was coming. She looked at the plane, Summit 412 at Gate B9, still connected to the jet bridge, still lit, still full of people. She had walked through this aisle serving and managing and maintaining the cabin of for 12 years. She did not look away from it. She stood there and she looked at it, and she thought about what 12 years felt like from this side of the evening. What it felt like to have built a career on a skill that had turned out to contain, at its foundation, something she had not allowed herself to name. She thought about the 5 passengers. She thought about their names, which she mostly did not know, because names were not the point of the system she had been operating. She thought about the woman in October, whose blazer she remembered, dark blue, good fabric, pressed, who had sat in economy row 17, with the expression of someone absorbing an indignity they were too tired to fight, who had taken her voucher and said thank you to the gate agent with the specific politeness of someone who has learned that the anger they feel is not safe to show. Carolyn thought, I knew her name. She showed me her ID. I looked at it and handed it back, and I have not thought about her name since. She thought about that. The gate agent said, Ma'am, operations is ready for you. Carolyn turned away from the window, walked toward the operations office, did not look back at the plane. Summit 412 began to move at 7:47 p. The pushback was slow and steady, the aircraft moving backward from the gate with the unhurried efficiency of something done 10,000 times before. The gate area outside receded. The terminal lights shifted to a new angle. The aircraft turned on the taxiway and pointed itself toward the runway. Raymond looked out the window and watched O'Hare fall away. The gate. B9. The connector where he had stood with his boarding pass and watched it scan green. Where Avery had pressed record. Where an evening had started that was going to go on being this evening for a long time after tonight. His phone buzzed. Walter Gaines, a text message. The journalist can reach me at the Los Angeles number. Tell her to call after 10 a. Raymond read it twice, wrote back. She'll call at 10, set the phone down. Gerald and Susan Price sat in 1B and 1C and did not speak. The silence between them was not hostile. It was the silence of two people processing in parallel and not yet ready to bring what they were processing into shared language. Gerald was thinking about the version of participation he had accepted without examining. The way a thing can be offered and you take it because it's offered and you don't ask why. You receive the benefit without looking at the cost that someone else is paying. He was thinking about how many times across a life he had done some version of that. He was finding more instances than he had expected. Susan was sitting with the moment Raymond had said, "You didn't stop it either." She had not responded because there was nothing to say. It was accurate. She had watched it happen and had chosen, in the way that comes from a life of choosing the path that requires the least from you, to assume the staff knew best. The staff had not known best. She had known that. Somewhere under the assumption, she had known. She thought, what does knowing and not acting make you? She did not let herself look away from the answer. Claire Hudson had her phone in her bag for the first time in 87 minutes. She was not watching the view count. She was not reading comments. She was looking out the window at taxiway lights, making long lines in the dark, other aircraft holding at their positions, all of them in motion toward somewhere. Derek said, "Final count was 28,000 before it moved to clips." She said, "It's going to keep going." He said, "Yeah." She was quiet. He said, "Does that feel strange?" She thought about it, honestly. She said, "What feels strange is that it happened. Not that people saw it, that it was real, and it happened, and without a camera, it would have been a form letter in 40 days." He said, "And Walter Gaines gets another form letter." She said, "Yeah." Neither of them said anything else. Avery Fields moved through first class with water, and the attentiveness of someone who has decided that doing her job well tonight is the form that integrity takes in the hours after everything else. She moved through each row with care, not performing the care, just doing it. She stopped at 1A. Raymond said, "Thank you." She said, "For the water," he said, "for all of it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to be okay, aren't I?" He said, "Yes." She said, "You don't know that for certain." He said, "I know what I'm going to say when they ask me about tonight. And I know that the audio you recorded is the reason 5 people on this base are going to receive more than a form letter. And I know that the call you made to a journalist in Atlanta is going to produce a story that makes it harder for this to happen quietly anywhere in our network for a long time." He looked at her. "You're going to be okay," she said. "Okay." She moved to the next row. Rowena Ash in 5A had been quiet since Raymond walked through to economy 2 hours earlier. She had watched everything. She had not filmed anything, choosing instead to watch with her actual eyes. Now she sat with her hands in her lap and thought about her son and a hotel lobby in Atlanta 3 years ago and the decisions she and her son had made to absorb what happened rather than fight it, because fighting had costs that were not evenly distributed, and they had known that and made the calculation accordingly. She thought. Raymond Holt fought it, she thought. He had resources her son did not have, and Walter Gaines did not have, and the 5 passengers on this base did not have, she thought. And he used them, not for himself, she thought. That is not nothing, and it is also not enough. And both of those things are true at the same time. She looked out the window. She thought, That is always the truth of this particular moment in this particular country. And the work is to hold both and keep going anyway. She settled back in her seat. Donald Prater in row 6 had his arms loose at his sides. He had uncrossed them fully when Frank Draper's statement came through the intercom. 26 years in the Air Force had given a finely exaggerated sense of what accountability sounded like when a person meant it versus when they were managing a situation. And what had come through that intercom was the first kind. He had nodded to himself, said nothing. Sometimes nothing is the complete response. Thomas Reese moved through the cabin with a quiet competence that the passengers felt without necessarily registering it consciously. That was the job at its best, not invisible exactly, but woven in, present without pressing. Summit 412 reached the runway threshold, paused. The brief stillness before commitment. Then the engines built. The aircraft moved. The acceleration pressed Raymond back into seat 1A. The runway lights blurred, and then stopped being distinguishable from each other, and then the ground fell away, and there was the moment that only exists in the first seconds of flight. The wheels leaving the surface, everything below becoming perspective instead of place. He looked out the window. Chicago at night from altitude, the grid of streets, the dark shape of the lake to the east, a void where the city ended and something else began. He looked for the south side, the neighborhood where a boy had stood on a roof on summer nights watching planes cross overhead and thinking about distance. Not yet having the words for what he was thinking, just the feeling that the world was larger than this roof, that the distance between here and somewhere else was crossable. He had crossed it. He was looking at it from the other side now. He thought about the audit starting tomorrow. The complaint records going back 3 years. The cases closed without investigation. The full number, which was going to be larger than 5. He thought, we will find all of it. He thought, we will not enjoy what we find. He thought, that is what finding it is for. He looked at the 2 halves of the boarding pass folded in his breast pocket. Not a souvenir, a record. The kind you keep because the thing it documents should not be allowed to become only memory. Because memory softens. The details blur. Eventually what happened becomes the shape of what happened, rather than the specific weight of it. The boarding pass was the weight. He was going to keep it. Summit 412 climbed through 20,000 feet and kept climbing, pushing up through the dark until the clouds were below and the stars were clear. In the long quiet of cruising altitude, in a cabin that had come through something and was finding its way back to the ordinary, Raymond Holt closed his eyes. Not to sleep, to be still, to be for a moment a man in a seat going where he was going. Nothing more, nothing less, which was all he had ever asked for and all tonight had ever been about. In row 14, Walter Gaines turned a page. He had been reading since 6:53 a.m. He was still reading now.